Captain Daniel Hayes stood at the gate on a bright, cloudless morning at JFK International Airport, the kind of day pilots loved: calm winds, clear skies, and no sign of storms on the horizon. With over 25 years in the cockpit, Daniel had seen it all, yet he approached each flight with the same steady professionalism. He greeted his crew warmly, his voice carrying the quiet reassurance that came from years of experience. Today's journey was a short hop from New York to Charlotte, a route he'd flown countless times. As passengers boarded, Daniel caught brief glimpses of their lives: a businessman scrolling through emails, a young couple leaning on each other sleepily, an elderly woman carefully folding her coat, and a little girl in seat 14A hugging a worn teddy bear as if it were a lifeline. In the cockpit, Daniel methodically ran through pre-flight checks with his co-pilot, calling out each step in a practiced rhythm. The hum of the engines, the click of switches, and the faint chatter from ground control filled the air, everything as expected. Outside, sunlight glinted off the wings, and the terminal slowly shrank from view as they prepared for takeoff. To Daniel, it felt like just another day in the skies, a familiar routine he could almost do with his eyes closed. But hidden beyond the horizon was a challenge that would push every skill, instinct, and ounce of courage he had, transforming this ordinary flight into a moment the world would never forget. The aircraft lifted gracefully from the runway, the city skyline shrinking beneath them as sunlight poured through the windows. Passengers settled in, some opening laptops, others closing their eyes for a quick nap. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Hayes kept a steady hand on the controls, his co-pilot monitoring the climb. Everything was smooth, until, without warning, a deafening bang shattered the calm. The plane jolted violently, and Daniel's heart lurched. Through the windshield, a sudden blur of wings, a flock of large geese, had slammed into both engines. Almost instantly, the cabin filled with the acrid smell of burning fuel, and alarms screamed in the cockpit. Daniel's training kicked in as he scanned the instruments: both engines had failed. The roar of power was replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the shrill warnings from the control panel. His co-pilot's voice was tight with disbelief. "We've lost both engines." Daniel locked eyes with him, the gravity of the moment clear without another word. In the cabin, passengers stirred, their conversations cut short by the change in the plane's tone and the sudden drop in altitude. Flight attendants, masking their own fear, moved quickly down the aisles, checking seatbelts and calming anxious faces. Outside, the blue sky seemed endless, but Daniel knew their window for action was narrowing by the second. He steadied his breathing. This was no longer a routine flight, it was a race against time, and every soul on board was depending on him to find a way through. The cockpit was tense, filled with the rhythmic beeping of warning alarms and the clipped exchanges between Captain Daniel Hayes and his co-pilot. They had lost both engines completely: no power, no thrust, only the heavy silence of a gliding aircraft. The altitude was dropping fast. Daniel's eyes darted between the altimeter and the terrain below. Returning to JFK was impossible, LaGuardia was too far. Every option the control tower offered was out of reach. Then, through the haze of adrenaline, he spotted it, a narrow stretch of icy water glinting in the morning sun. It was risky, nearly impossible, but it might be their only chance. "Prepare for a water landing," he announced over the intercom, his voice calm but firm. In the cabin, panic rippled instantly. The little girl in 14A clutched her teddy bear tighter, tears welling in her eyes as her mother whispered soothing words. An elderly man closed his eyes and began to pray, his lips trembling. Flight attendants braced themselves against the seats, shouting instructions over the chaos. Daniel kept his voice steady as he spoke to his co-pilot, mapping out the landing in seconds. The controls felt heavier, the plane sluggish, but he refused to let fear cloud his focus. The river was approaching fast, framed by rows of frozen docks and city buildings. There would be no second attempt, this was it. His hands gripped the yoke firmly. "We're going to get them home," he thought, pushing everything else out of his mind except the lives entrusted to him. The river stretched out before them, a cold, steel-blue ribbon winding through the city. Captain Daniel Hayes kept the nose level, fighting the sinking feeling in his chest as the powerless aircraft descended. The plane's frame shuddered in the biting wind, every second pulling them closer to the water. "Brace! Brace! Brace!" the flight attendants shouted in unison, their voices urgent but controlled. Passengers curled forward, gripping their seats, breaths held in silent prayers. Then, impact. A violent splash erupted as the belly of the plane skimmed the icy surface. The jolt rattled through every bone, a roar of water and metal filling the air. For a heart-stopping moment, Daniel feared they'd break apart. But the fuselage held. The aircraft slid across the river like a skipping stone before finally slowing to a stop, bobbing gently in the freezing current. Relief washed over him, but there was no time to dwell. He unbuckled, checking on his co-pilot, then grabbed the radio to report, "We're in the water. Everyone's alive." In the cabin, cries turned to gasps of disbelief as passengers realized they had survived. Daniel moved down the aisle, helping open exits, guiding people toward the wings and life rafts. The icy wind bit at their faces, but rescue boats were already on their way. Even when the last passenger was safe, Daniel stayed on board, scanning every row to ensure no one was left behind. Only then did he step off, the cold water splashing at his boots, the final one to leave his plane. Hours later, Captain Daniel Hayes sat in a quiet hospital room, a blanket draped over his shoulders. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving only exhaustion and the steady hum of distant voices in the hallway. On a small TV in the corner, news anchors replayed footage of passengers standing on the plane's wings, rescue boats surrounding them. Headlines called it "a miracle on the river." Reporters were calling him a hero, but Daniel didn't feel like one. In his mind, he had simply done what any pilot should, bring everyone home alive. The door creaked open, and a familiar voice broke his thoughts. "Captain." It was the little girl from seat 14A, still holding her battered teddy bear. Her mother stood behind her, eyes red from crying, gratitude written all over her face. The girl walked up, small hands trembling, and pressed the teddy into his lap. "You saved my mommy and me, so he's yours now." Daniel's throat tightened. He picked up the bear gently, unsure if it was the cold or emotion making his hands shake. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but full of weight. As the girl smiled, Daniel realized the truth: it wasn't the skill of the landing that mattered most, but the lives it protected. The faces of every passenger, safe because of those impossible seconds in the air, would stay with him forever. And in that moment, he understood, sometimes the measure of a life is not in the miles you've flown, but in the people you've brought safely home.